The old grand piano sat in the corner of the hotel lobby, mostly forgotten except for the occasional dusting by the cleaning staff. It was a beautiful instrument, polished black with intricate gold details along its edges, but in the rush of modern life, few people ever stopped to appreciate it. The Bellevue Grand was one of those hotels that tried to balance old-world charm with modern luxury, and the piano was definitely part of the charm. It was a busy Friday evening. The hotel was hosting its annual charity gala for children's education, an event that brought together the city's wealthy and influential. Women in flowing gowns and men in crisp tuxedos filled the spacious lobby, their laughter and conversation creating a steady hum that bounced off the marble floors and high ceilings. Among the hotel staff, there was a controlled chaos as they prepared for the evening. Waiters in black vests rushed through with trays of champagne flutes. The reception desk was handling last-minute check-ins, and the event coordinator was frantically giving instructions through her headset. Nobody noticed when the older man entered through the revolving front doors. He wasn't dressed for a gala. He wore a simple gray sweater over a button-up shirt, with pants that had clearly seen better days. His shoes were well-worn but clean. His hair was silver and a bit too long, brushing against the collar of his shirt. Deep lines marked his face, especially around his eyes, the kind that come from years of laughter and squinting in the sun. The man paused just inside the entrance, taking in the scene with calm, observant eyes. He seemed neither impressed nor intimidated by the luxury surrounding him or the important people filling the space. Instead, his gaze moved past all of it, settling on the grand piano in the corner. For a moment, he just stood there watching the instrument as if it were an old friend he hadn't seen in years. Then, with purpose in his steps but no hurry, he began to make his way across the lobby. He moved carefully through the crowd, apologizing softly when he had to step between conversations. Most people barely glanced at him, assuming he was someone's driver or perhaps a relative of a hotel employee. He didn't belong in this world of designer dresses and expensive watches, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet dignity that suggested he didn't need to belong. As he approached the piano, a young hotel employee named Raj noticed him and frowned slightly. Raj had been working at the Bellevue for only 3 months, and he was eager to prove himself. The last thing he wanted was for some random person to cause a disturbance during such an important event. "Sir," Raj began, stepping toward the man. "I'm sorry, but that piano is just for—" "Let him be," came a voice from behind. It was Ms. Chen, the head concierge who had worked at the hotel for over 20 years. She put a gentle hand on Raj's arm. "That piano hasn't been played properly in ages. As long as he doesn't disturb the guests, where's the harm?" Raj hesitated but nodded. Ms. Chen had been at the hotel longer than most of the furniture. If she said something was okay, it usually was. The older man either didn't notice their exchange or chose to ignore it. He reached the piano and ran his hand lightly over its smooth surface, a look of appreciation crossing his weathered face. Then, with surprising grace for someone his age, he pulled out the bench and sat down. He adjusted the bench carefully, moving it forward and then back until it was just right. His movements were methodical, practiced, the actions of someone who had done this countless times before. He straightened his back and positioned his hands just above the keys, not yet touching them. A few feet away, a wealthy couple paused their conversation about property investments to glance curiously at the man. The woman whispered something to her husband, who shrugged dismissively. Near the front desk, the manager looked up from his computer, his expression hovering between concern and curiosity. For a long moment, the man just sat there, eyes closed, breathing deeply. It was as if he was gathering himself, preparing for something important, or perhaps he was listening to music that only he could hear. Ms. Chen watched from a distance, a small smile playing on her lips. In her years at the hotel, she had developed an intuition about people. Something told her this wasn't just an old man who wanted to plink away at a few keys. Across the lobby, the event coordinator was directing the catering staff when she noticed the man at the piano. She frowned and touched her headset, ready to call security if necessary. The gala was about to move into the main ballroom, but many guests were still arriving and mingling in the lobby. An impromptu piano recital wasn't on her carefully planned schedule. The older man opened his eyes. He flexed his fingers once, twice. Then, with a small breath that seemed to center him, He placed his hands on the keys. No one expected what happened next. The first notes that filled the lobby were so clear, so perfectly articulated that several nearby conversations simply stopped mid-sentence. The man had chosen to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, but even those who couldn't name the piece recognized its beauty. His fingers moved across the keys with fluid grace, each note flowing into the next like water in a stream. There was no hesitation, no stumbling. This wasn't someone who played occasionally or had taken lessons as a child. This was mastery. The piano itself seemed to come alive under his touch. Notes that had been slightly off-key when played by the hotel's occasional entertainers now rang true and pure. It was as if the instrument had been waiting for hands that knew how to truly bring out its voice. Raj stood transfixed, his earlier concerns forgotten. Next to him, Ms. Chen nodded slowly, her intuition confirmed. "You see?" she whispered, though she wasn't really talking to Raj. "Some people surprise you." More heads began to turn toward the corner of the lobby. A waiter paused with his tray of drinks, momentarily forgetting his task. Two businessmen who had been discussing a merger deal fell silent, their attention drawn to the unexpected music. The event coordinator touched her headset again, but instead of calling security, she simply said, "Hold on," to whoever was on the other end. Her eyes were fixed on the pianist, her clipboard lowered to her side. The man played with his eyes half closed, his body swaying slightly with the music. There was nothing showy about his performance. No dramatic gestures or exaggerated expressions. Instead, there was an honesty to it, a direct connection between the player and the music that made it all the more powerful. As the piece progressed, something remarkable happened in the busy lobby. People began to pause. Conversations trailed off. The constant movement slowed. In a room full of important people with busy lives and packed schedules, time seemed to briefly stand still. A young girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, dressed in a frilly dress that suggested she was attending the gala with her parents, broke away from her mother's hand and moved closer to the piano. She stood just a few feet away, watching the man's hands with wide-eyed wonder. Her mother started to call her back, but then stopped, deciding to let her daughter watch. The hotel manager had now fully abandoned his post at the front desk and was making his way toward the piano. His face showed a mixture of confusion and appreciation. This wasn't a scheduled performance, and he should probably ask the man to stop. But how could he interrupt something so beautiful? Outside, new guests continued to arrive, stepping through the revolving doors only to be immediately enveloped by the music. Many paused just inside the entrance, surprised by the unexpected greeting. The man continued to play, seemingly unaware of the attention he was gathering. Or perhaps he was aware but simply unbothered by it. His focus remained entirely on the music, on drawing out every nuance, every subtle shift in emotion that Debussy had woven into the piece. As Clair de Lune approached its gentle conclusion, the lobby had grown remarkably quiet. Even the clinking of glasses had stopped. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete silence, that rare and perfect quiet that follows truly moving music. Then, as if waking from a shared dream, people began to stir. Someone started to applaud and others quickly joined in. The applause spread across the lobby, growing in volume. The man at the piano opened his eyes fully, looking almost surprised at the response. He gave a small, humble nod of acknowledgement. But instead of standing to take a bow or addressing his impromptu audience, he simply repositioned his hands and began to play again. This time, he chose a piece that fewer people recognized, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The notes danced through the air, somehow both melancholy and hopeful at the same time. More guests gathered around now, forming a loose semicircle around the piano. The event coordinator checked her watch and then, making a quick decision, whispered something to her assistant. The gala could wait a few more minutes. No one in the growing crowd knew yet who this unassuming man was. No one recognized the international star who had once filled concert halls around the world, whose recordings had won countless awards, who had disappeared from public life so completely that music magazines still occasionally ran "Whatever happened to" articles about him. For now, he was just an old man playing the piano in a hotel lobby. But something extraordinary was about to unfold, and everyone present could somehow sense it, the feeling that they were witnessing the beginning of an unexpected story. The Chopin nocturne filled the lobby with its gentle rise and fall, like waves washing against a moonlit shore. As the man continued to play, something in the atmosphere of the hotel began to change. The usual invisible barriers between strangers, those unspoken rules that keep people in their own bubbles, seemed to dissolve note by note. Two older women who had been sitting on opposite ends of a lobby sofa now sat side by side, their heads tilted in identical poses of appreciation. A businessman set down his phone, leaving a text message half-written, completely forgetting the urgent deal he had been so focused on moments before. A hotel maid who had been about to slip discreetly through a side door instead leaned against the wall, permission to pause briefly granted by the unexpected beauty filling her workplace. The young girl who had approached the piano first was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, her fancy dress pooled around her like a flower. Her mother had given up on propriety and joined her, high heels kicked off and tucked neatly under a nearby chair. Ms. Chen, the head concierge, watched it all with quiet satisfaction. In her 20 years at the Bellevue Grand, she had seen countless important people pass through these doors: politicians, celebrities, business tycoons. But rarely had she seen someone transform the space like this unassuming man at the piano. "Who is he?" Raj whispered to her, unable to tear his eyes away from the pianist's hands as they moved across the keys with impossible grace. Ms. Chen shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "But he plays like he's telling his life story through the music." As the nocturne built toward its emotional peak, the man's body swayed slightly, his face reflecting every nuance in the music. The longing, the brief moments of joy, the gentle resignation. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He was having a deeply personal conversation with the piano, and they were all just fortunate enough to overhear it. The hotel manager had given up any thought of interruption. Instead, he had discreetly signaled to the bartender, who understood immediately. The staff began quietly offering champagne to the gathered guests, turning the impromptu concert into an unexpected feature of the evening. If you can't stop it, embrace it. That was the first rule of luxury hospitality. As the nocturne came to its conclusion, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. This time, the man acknowledged it with a slight smile and a humble nod. A few people approached the piano, drawn by an urge to be closer to this unexpected magic in their midst. "That was extraordinary," said an older gentleman in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. "Do you take requests?" The pianist looked up, meeting the man's eyes directly for the first time. There was a moment of hesitation, as if he was considering whether to speak or simply let the music continue to speak for him. "Perhaps one or two," he finally said. His voice was soft but clear, with just a hint of an accent that was difficult to place. It carried the same quiet confidence as his playing, nothing to prove, nothing to hide. This simple exchange opened a floodgate. Suddenly, everyone seemed to have a favorite piece they wanted to hear. A woman in a red dress asked for Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. An elderly man requested a Schubert impromptu. Someone else called out for Gershwin. The pianist listened to each request with the same patient attention, neither overwhelmed nor annoyed by the sudden attention. Then, without comment, he began to play again, but not any of the requested pieces. Instead, his fingers found the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. This was no easy piece. Even professional pianists approached it with respect and caution. It demanded technical precision, emotional depth, and physical stamina. And yet, this stranger played it as naturally as if he were simply having a conversation. What made it even more remarkable was that he was playing both parts, not just the piano solo but hints of the orchestra parts as well, somehow suggesting the full richness of the concerto on a single instrument. It was like watching a master magician perform an impossible trick without any flash or distraction, just pure, undeniable skill. Near the back of the growing crowd, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses went very still. He had been on his way out of the hotel when the music caught him, and now he stood frozen halfway to the door, his briefcase hanging forgotten at his side. He pushed his glasses up his nose and began moving closer to the piano, his expression growing increasingly intense. The event coordinator was now frantically checking her watch and whispering into her headset. The gala dinner was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, and yet none of the guests were moving toward the ballroom. They remained clustered around the piano, completely captivated, One of her assistants approached her, looking panicked. "Should we start without them?" the young woman asked, gesturing to the crowd. The coordinator shook her head. "Give it 5 more minutes," she said. "I don't think we could drag them away if we tried." Then, after a moment's thought, she added, "Actually, find out who that man is. Maybe we can convince him to play during dinner." The assistant nodded and began working her way toward the piano, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. Meanwhile, the man with the wire-rimmed glasses had managed to push his way to the front of the crowd. He stood now with his arms crossed, studying the pianist with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Unlike the other listeners, his face showed not just appreciation, but recognition and growing disbelief. The Rachmaninoff piece built to its thunderous climax, the man's fingers flying across the keys with both power and precision. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, but his concentration never wavered. The lobby, with its marble floors and high ceilings, had accidentally perfect acoustics, allowing the music to soar and envelop everyone present. When the final chords resonated through the space, there was a moment of stunned silence followed by enthusiastic applause. Several people rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. The pianist acknowledged this with a slightly deeper nod but remained seated at the bench. As the applause began to fade, the man with the wire-rimmed glasses stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "But aren't you Anton Volsky?" The question hung in the air. The pianist looked up, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, and the lobby grew quiet again as people waited for his response. "I used to be," he finally said, his voice so soft that people had to lean forward to hear him. The effect of these 4 simple words was electric. Whispers rippled through the crowd immediately. "Did he say Anton Volsky? The Anton Volsky? I thought he was dead." "No, he just disappeared years ago." The man with the glasses, who turned out to be Dr. Thomas Reed, a music critic for the city's most prestigious cultural magazine, stepped closer to the piano. "I was at your last performance at Carnegie Hall," he said, his voice tinged with awe. 15 years ago. Then you just vanished." More whispers swept through the crowd. Even those who weren't familiar with classical music could sense that something extraordinary was happening. The event coordinator had abandoned all pretense of trying to move people to the ballroom, and was now frantically typing on her phone, likely updating the evening's program. The pianist, Anton Volsky, looked down at his hands resting on the keys. They were older now, with prominent veins and slight arthritis in the knuckles, but they still held the same magic they had 15 years ago when he had been at the height of his fame. "I needed to step away," he said simply. "But why?" Dr. Reed pressed. "You were at the peak of your career. Critics called you the greatest pianist of your generation. There were rumors, health problems, creative differences with conductors, even political asylum issues." Volsky shook his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Nothing so dramatic," he said. "I just needed to remember why I played in the first place." The young girl who had been sitting on the floor stood up and approached the piano. Unlike the adults, she wasn't intimidated by the revelation of the pianist's identity. To her, he was just the man who had made beautiful music. "Why do you play?" she asked, her voice clear and curious in the way that only children's voices can be. Volsky looked at her and his face softened. He seemed to appreciate her directness, the way she cut through all the mystique and fame to the heart of the matter. "For moments like this," he answered, "not for the applause or the reviews or the prestige. For the way music can make time stand still. For the way it can bring strangers together in a shared experience." The hotel manager, seeing an opportunity, stepped forward. "Mr. Volsky," he said, "we would be incredibly honored if you would consider playing for our charity gala tonight. It's for children's education programs. We can offer compensation, of course." Volsky held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No compensation," he said, "but I would be happy to play for your charity. Children and music. These are things worth supporting." The manager beamed, trying not to look too relieved as he glanced at the event coordinator, who gave him a thumbs up from across the room. Dr. Reed was still staring at Volsky as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "The world has missed your music," he said. "Will you come back? Record again? Perform in concert halls?" Volsky didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the piano and began to play once more, this time a simple, haunting melody that nobody recognized. It was his own composition, though nobody knew that yet. He had written it during those years away from the spotlight, sitting at a much more modest piano in a small apartment overlooking a quiet park. As the melody unfurled, telling its story without words, the question hung in the air. Would Anton Volsky, the legendary pianist who had walked away at the height of fame, return to the world stage? Or was this unexpected performance in a hotel lobby just a brief glimpse of what the music world had lost? The answer would come soon enough. But for now there was only the music, filling the space between strangers and turning an ordinary evening into something none of them would ever forget. Word spread through the hotel like wildfire. By the time Anton Volsky finished his impromptu piece, hotel staff were quietly ushering the growing crowd toward the ballroom, whispering to each new group of curious onlookers. Anton Volsky is playing tonight. Yes, God, that Anton Volsky. The charity gala was suddenly the hottest ticket in town. People who had sent regrets were now calling the front desk, asking if they could still attend. Guests already present were texting friends and family. The event coordinator, who had been stressed about meeting attendance targets just an hour ago, was now frantically working with the hotel staff to accommodate extra tables. In a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the excitement, Volsky sat with a cup of tea that Ms. Chen had brought him. His hands cupped the warm mug gently, those remarkable fingers, capable of such extraordinary feats at the keyboard, now engaged in this simple, ordinary task. Will you need anything special for your performance, Mr. Volsky? Ms. Chen asked. She maintained her professional composure, though inside she was as starstruck as everyone else. In her youth, she had studied piano seriously before life took her in a different direction. Volsky had been one of her idols. Just a well-tuned piano, he replied with a small smile, and perhaps a glass of water. Dr. Reed, the music critic, hovered nearby, clearly bursting with questions but trying to respect the pianist's space. Eventually, Volsky glanced up at him and nodded slightly, an invitation to join him. I've been following classical music for 30 years, Dr. Reed said as he sat down. And I never expected, there were so many theories about why you left. He adjusted his glasses nervously. Some people thought you had health problems. Others said you had a breakdown after that critic in Vienna. People love mysteries, Volsky interrupted gently. Sometimes the truth is much simpler. I left because I needed to remember why I played in the first place. And did you? Remember, Volsky took a sip of his tea before answering. His eyes drifted across the lobby, taking in the grandeur of the hotel, so different from the places he had been playing these past 15 years. Community centers, retirement homes, small-town churches with out-of-tune pianos. Yes, he said finally. I remembered. Music isn't about concert halls or critics or standing ovations. It's about connection, about saying things with notes that can't be said with words. Across the lobby, the hotel manager was deep in conversation with the event coordinator. They kept glancing over at Volsky, their expressions a mixture of excitement and worry. This unexpected development was both a tremendous opportunity and a logistical challenge. The young girl who had asked Volsky why he played was now sitting with her parents near the hotel restaurant. She was animatedly explaining to them who the piano man was, though it was clear from their indulgent smiles that they didn't quite understand the significance. Daddy. He's like the Michael Jordan of pianos, she insisted, using a comparison that might make classical music purists cringe, but that captured the essence of Volsky's status perfectly. Meanwhile, Raj, the young hotel employee who had initially tried to stop Volsky from playing, was on his phone, watching a YouTube video of a much younger Anton Volsky performing with the London Symphony Orchestra. He looked back and forth between the video and the older man sitting quietly with his tea, trying to reconcile the two images. Dr. Reed couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. Where have you been all these years? He asked. What have you been doing? Volsky set down his cup. Living, he said simply. I bought a small house in a quiet town upstate. I give piano lessons to children who can't afford them. I play at the local nursing home every Sunday. He smiled slightly. I grow tomatoes. Tomatoes? Dr. Reed repeated as if Volsky had said he'd been living on the moon. The best you've ever tasted, Volsky said with unexpected pride. There's something about getting your hands in the soil that balances all those hours at the keyboard. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of an elegant older woman in a blue evening gown. She walked with the help of a cane but carried herself with dignity and purpose. "Mr. Volsky," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age but still commanding. "I'm Eleanor Winters, the chairperson of tonight's gala." Volsky stood politely, recognizing the name. Eleanor Winters was a major patron of the arts in the city, known for her generous support of music education programs. "Mrs. Winters," he acknowledged with a slight bow. "It's an honor." "The honor is entirely ours," she replied. "When I was told you had agreed to play tonight, well, I could hardly believe it." She studied his face for a moment. "I was at your debut with the New York Philharmonic, 35 years ago. You played Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto." Something flickered in Volsky's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a touch of nostalgia. "You have a good memory. Some performances stay with you forever," she said simply. Then, getting down to business, "We've adjusted the evening's program. The string quartet we had booked is happy to step aside. We thought perhaps 20 minutes after dinner. Whatever you'd like to play, of course." Volsky nodded his agreement. 20 minutes will be perfect." As Mrs. Winters walked away, Dr. Reed leaned forward eagerly. "This could be your comeback," he said. "I have connections with all the major venues. One phone call and I could have the Carnegie Hall people here tonight. They would clear their schedule for Anton Volsky's return." For the first time, a shadow crossed Volsky's face. "I haven't agreed to a comeback," he said quietly. "But surely after tonight." "Tonight is for the children's charity," Volsky said firmly. "Nothing more." Dr. Reed opened his mouth to argue, but was interrupted by the arrival of the hotel manager, who informed Volsky that the ballroom was ready and guests were being seated for dinner. If Mr. Volsky would like to see the piano he would be playing later, now would be a good time. As they walked toward the ballroom, Volsky moved with the unhurried pace of a man who had learned the value of taking his time. Hotel staff and guests alike stopped what they were doing to watch him pass, whispering to each other once he was out of earshot. The ballroom was a marvel of old-world elegance. Crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed columns and tables adorned with white roses and flickering candles. At the far end of the room, on a small stage, stood a magnificent Steinway grand piano. Volsky approached it with reverence, running his hand along its curved edge before sitting on the bench. He played a few notes, testing the action and the tone. A small smile of approval crossed his face. "The acoustics in here are quite good," he commented to the hotel manager, who beamed as if he had personally designed the room. As Volsky continued to acquaint himself with the instrument, the first dinner guests began to filter into the ballroom. They took their seats at assigned tables, their excited chatter filling the space. Many craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the legendary pianist at the Steinway. Among them was a distinguished-looking couple who attracted their own share of attention. The man was tall with silver-streaked dark hair, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo that spoke of old money and good taste. The woman beside him was equally elegant, her silver hair swept up in a classic style. They made their way directly to Volsky at the piano. As they approached, Volsky looked up and his composed expression faltered for just a moment. "Anton," the man said warmly, extending his hand. "It's been a long time." "Nicholas," Volsky replied, standing to shake the offered hand. "I didn't expect to see you here." "We wouldn't have missed it," the woman said, her voice carrying a hint of the same accent as Volsky's. "Not once we heard you were playing. There was history between these three. That much was obvious to anyone watching." Nicholas had been Volsky's manager in the years before his disappearance. His wife, Lucia, had been Volsky's most influential teacher at the conservatory in their home country. They had been as close as family once before, well before whatever had led to Volsky's withdrawal from public life. Their conversation was brief but intense, conducted in low voices that didn't carry to curious onlookers. When they parted, Lucia squeezed Volsky's hand and said something that made him nod thoughtfully. As dinner was served, Volsky slipped out of the ballroom for a moment of quiet. He found himself back in the lobby, now mostly empty as everyone had moved to the gala. The grand piano where he had first played earlier that evening sat silent. He walked over to it and lightly touched the keys without pressing them down, lost in thought. The unexpected reunion with Nicholas and Lucia had stirred memories he had carefully packed away years ago. The pressure of constant touring, the endless scrutiny, the gradual loss of joy as music became work. but also the transcendent moments when everything disappeared except the music itself, when his playing could move thousands to tears or ecstatic applause. "Are you all right?" The voice startled him. It was Ms. Chen, the concierge, watching him with concern. "Just gathering my thoughts," he replied. She nodded understandingly. "You know," she said after a moment, "I saw you play once. In Seoul, almost 20 years ago. I was studying piano then and saved for months to buy a ticket." Volsky looked at her with new interest. "And now you're a hotel concierge." "Life takes unexpected turns," she said with a small smile. "But I've never regretted those piano lessons. They taught me to listen, really listen. That's a skill that serves me well in this job." "Music stays with us," Volsky agreed, "even when we can no longer play." A discreet cough interrupted them. It was one of the event staff, coming to inform Volsky that dessert was being served and his performance would be expected in 15 minutes. As Volsky made his way back to the ballroom, he felt a strange mix of emotions: nostalgia for the past, contentment with the simple life he had built, and something else, something he hadn't felt in years: the thrill of sharing his music with an appreciative audience, not for fame or acclaim, but for the pure joy of connection. The question that hung in the air: would tonight mark Anton Volsky's return to the world stage? Or would it be just a brief shining moment before he returned to his quiet life of teaching and tomato growing? Remained unanswered. But as he entered the ballroom to enthusiastic applause, one thing was certain: the music he would play tonight would touch hearts and perhaps change lives, just as it had done in the lobby earlier that evening. The ballroom hummed with anticipation. Dessert plates were being cleared away, coffee was being served, and every conversation seemed to center on the same topic: the legendary pianist who was about to perform. People who had attended the gala purely out of social obligation or business networking now found themselves genuinely excited, checking their watches and glancing toward the piano on the small stage. Eleanor Winters approached the microphone set up near the piano. The room quieted immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. Tonight was already special. A chance to support music and arts education for children who might otherwise never experience their transformative power. But now we have been granted an unexpected gift. She paused, looking around the room with a smile. "Many of you know the name Anton Volsky. For those who don't, he is simply one of the greatest pianists of our time. 15 years ago, at the height of his career, he stepped away from public performance. Until tonight." A murmur ran through the audience. "I won't attempt to explain why he left or why he has chosen this moment to play for us again. Some gifts don't need explanation. They only need to be received with gratitude." She turned toward the side of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my extraordinary honor to present Anton Volsky." The applause began before he even stepped onto the stage. Volsky emerged from the shadows, now dressed in a simple black suit that someone had managed to find for him. It wasn't perfectly tailored like the tuxedos worn by many of the male guests, but he carried himself with such natural dignity that it hardly mattered. He acknowledged the applause with a modest nod, then took his seat at the piano. Unlike many performers who take a moment to gather themselves, to create suspense or drama, Volsky simply placed his hands on the keys and began to play. He started with Bach, the prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. It was a piece often given to beginning piano students, deceptively simple at first glance, but under Volsky's hands it revealed all its hidden complexity and beauty. The flowing arpeggios seemed to hang in the air like strands of perfectly formed crystal. In the audience, Nicholas leaned toward his wife Lucia and whispered, "Still Bach, always Bach," to center himself. Lucia nodded, her eyes never leaving Volsky's hands. "But watch," she whispered back. "He'll move to Chopin next. He always does." Sure enough, as the last notes of the Bach prelude faded, Volsky transitioned seamlessly into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The change was like watching someone shift from speaking clearly and precisely to suddenly pouring their heart out in the most intimate confession. The ballade was a challenging piece, full of technical difficulties that would test any pianist. But with Volsky, technique disappeared. There was only emotion, only story. His body moved with the music now, sometimes leaning forward as if to whisper a secret to the piano, sometimes pulling back during the thunderous sections. In the third row, the young girl who had asked Volsky why he played sat between her parents, her eyes wide and unblinking. She had never heard music like this before, had never seen a grown-up so completely lost in what they were doing, so unaware of being watched. It was a moment that would stay with her forever, though she didn't know it yet. Near the back of the room, Dr. Reed, the music critic, was frantically taking notes on his phone. His hands were shaking slightly. In his 30-year career, he had reviewed thousands of concerts, but he knew he was witnessing something rare. Not just technical perfection, but that elusive quality that separates good musicians from great ones. The ability to make you forget you're listening to music at all, until you're simply experiencing pure emotion. As the Chopin piece built to its dramatic conclusion, several people in the audience were openly weeping. Mrs. Winters dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. The hotel manager stood at the back of the room, his earlier concerns about scheduling and protocol completely forgotten as he, too, was transported by the music. When the final chord of the ballad faded, there was that special silence again, the collective held breath that follows truly great art. Then the applause erupted, people rising to their feet in spontaneous homage. Volsky acknowledged this with a slight bow of his head but remained seated. He was not finished yet. His next choice surprised everyone who knew his repertoire. Instead of another classical piece, he began to play a hauntingly beautiful melody that few in the audience recognized. It was simple compared to the technical fireworks of the Chopin, but somehow even more moving in its directness. Nicholas and Lucia exchanged puzzled glances. This was not a piece from the standard classical repertoire they had managed and taught for decades. What no one in the room knew, what even Nicholas and Lucia didn't know, was that Volsky was playing his own composition. During his 15 years away from the concert stage, he had been writing music as well as growing tomatoes and teaching children. This piece, which he called simply Return, was something he had composed just 6 months ago, never intending anyone but himself to hear it. The melody spoke of loneliness, of quiet mornings watching the sun rise over distant hills, of small joys found in simple things, but it also carried a thread of something else, a question perhaps, or a longing, as if the solitary life, for all its peace, was missing something essential. As he played the final notes of his composition, Volsky looked up at the audience for the first time since he had begun playing. His eyes, normally so guarded, were open and vulnerable. He had shared something deeply personal, and in that moment, everyone in the room felt connected to him, not to the legend or the mysterious figure who had disappeared, but to the man himself. The applause this time was different, still enthusiastic but somehow more intimate, more like a conversation than a celebration. People weren't just applauding his skill, they were thanking him for the gift he had given them. Volsky stood and bowed properly now. He had planned to play one more piece, but something told him this was the right moment to end. He had said what he needed to say through the music. As he made his way off the stage, Nicholas and Lucia were the first to reach him. Lucia took his hands in hers, examining them as only a teacher would. "Your fourth finger still drops a little in the difficult passages," she said, then broke into a smile. "But otherwise, perfect, as always." Nicholas shook his head in amazement. "That last piece, I didn't recognize it. Something new," Volsky said simply. "Yours?" Lucia asked, her eyebrows rising in surprise. Volsky nodded. "You've been composing," Nicholas said. It wasn't a question. All these years. Before Volsky could respond, they were joined by Mrs. Winters and several members of the charity board, all eager to thank him. Then came Dr. Reed, business card extended, talking rapidly about exclusive interviews and special features. The crowd around Volsky grew quickly. Everyone wanted a moment with him, to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they had been, to ask where he had been all these years. He answered their questions politely but briefly, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention after so long away from the spotlight. From across the room, Ms. Chen observed the growing crush of people around the pianist. She caught his eye briefly and saw the flicker of something like panic cross his face. With the smooth efficiency that made her excellent at her job, she moved through the crowd toward him. "Mr. Volsky," she said, just loudly enough to be heard over the chatter. "Your car is ready whenever you'd like to leave." There was no car, of course, but Volsky gave her a look of such profound gratitude that she knew she had read the situation correctly. "If you'll excuse me," he said to the group around him. "It's been a long day." As Ms. Chen led him toward a side exit, Dr. Reed hurried after them. "But Mr. Volsky," he called. "What about tomorrow?" "Carnegie Hall is already interested. I've made some calls. This could be the comeback the music world has been waiting for." Volsky paused. For a moment, something flickered across his face. A hint of the younger man he had once been, the rising star who had played in all the great concert halls of the world. Then it was gone, replaced by the calm certainty of the older, wiser man he had become. "I haven't decided about tomorrow yet," he said quietly. As they continued toward the exit, Nicholas appeared suddenly beside them. "Anton," he said urgently, "we need to talk. About your future. About your music." Volsky stopped and turned to his former manager and friend. "Yes," he agreed, surprising them both. "We do need to talk. But not tonight." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pen that he had borrowed earlier from the hotel desk. He wrote something down and handed it to Nicholas. "This is where I'm staying in the city," he said. "Come for coffee tomorrow. Both you and Lucia. We'll talk then." Nicholas looked down at the address. A modest hotel in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing like the luxury establishments where Volsky had stayed during his touring years. "Coffee," Nicholas repeated, nodding. "Tomorrow." They had reached the side door now. Ms. Chen held it open discreetly. "Thank you," Volsky said to her. "For everything." "It was an honor, Mr. Volsky," she replied. Then with a small smile she added, "My mother will never believe I met you." Volsky smiled back. "Tell her I said hello," and then he was gone, slipping out into the night. Behind him, the ballroom still buzzed with excitement. Dr. Reed was already typing furiously on his phone, no doubt breaking the news of Anton Volsky's unexpected return to the music world. Mrs. Winters was announcing that tonight's gala had raised more money for music education than any previous year, but Volsky himself walked alone. Through the quiet streets, his hands in his pockets, his mind full of music and memories and possibilities. The question that had hung in the air since his first notes in the hotel lobby remained unanswered. Was this truly a return, or just a brief, shining moment before he disappeared again? Even Volsky himself didn't know the answer yet. But for the first time in 15 years, he was genuinely curious to find out. Morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting soft patterns across a modest hotel room. Anton Volsky sat at a small table by the window, a cup of coffee cooling beside him as he read the newspaper. His photo was on the front page of the arts section, a slightly blurry image someone had taken with their phone during last night's performance. The headline read, "Return of a Legend. Anton Volsky surprises charity gala after 15-year absence." Volsky skimmed the article, written hastily by Dr. Reed for the morning edition. It was full of breathless excitement and speculation about what this meant for the music world. There were quotes from attendees describing the performance as transcendent and life-changing. There were also questions, many questions, about where he had been all these years and what his plans were now. Volsky folded the newspaper and set it aside. His phone, an old model that Nicholas had once teased him about, had been ringing all morning. Music directors, concert promoters, record label executives. Word had spread quickly, and everyone wanted to be the first to secure the comeback of Anton Volsky. He had answered none of the calls. Instead, he had spent the early morning hours doing what he did every day, playing the piano. The hotel had arranged for an upright to be brought to his room last night. Not a fine instrument like the Steinway at the gala, but adequate for his morning practice. There was a knock at the door precisely at 10 o'clock. Nicholas had always been punctual. Volsky opened the door to find his old manager and Lucia standing there, both looking slightly unsure of themselves, an unusual state for two people who had navigated the cutthroat world of classical music with such confidence for decades. "Come in," Volsky said, stepping aside. "The coffee is fresh." The room was small but clean and bright. There were no luxury amenities, no elaborate breakfast spread, none of the trappings that had once been standard in Volsky's touring days. Just a simple room with basic furniture, the rented piano, and a stunning view of a nearby park. Lucia moved immediately to the piano, running her hand over it with the automatic assessment of a lifelong teacher. "Not a bad action," she commented. "A bit bright in the upper register, perhaps." Nicholas remained standing, taking in the simplicity of Volsky's accommodations. "You could have stayed anywhere," he said. After last night, any hotel in the city would have given you their finest suite. Volsky poured coffee for his guests. I like this room, he said simply. It has good light. They sat around the small table, an echo of countless meetings in hotel rooms around the world years ago, when they had been a team. Volsky the rising star, Nicholas the shrewd manager guiding his career, and Lucia the demanding teacher who had shaped his artistry since he was a boy of 12 arriving at the conservatory. You played beautifully last night, Lucia said, cradling her coffee cup. Different than before, more honest somehow. Volsky nodded. It was perhaps the highest compliment she had ever given him, and he knew what it had cost her to say it. Lucia had never been one for easy praise. That piece at the end, Nicholas said, leaning forward, your composition. It was extraordinary, Anton. How many others have you written? Dozens, Volsky admitted. Maybe hundreds. I'm not sure anymore. Nicholas and Lucia exchanged glances. And no one has heard them? Lucia asked, clearly troubled by the thought of all that music existing unshared. The children I teach have heard some of them. The residents at Pine Grove Nursing Home have heard others. Volsky smiled slightly. Mrs. Abernathy, she's 94. She says my third nocturne helps her sleep better than her medication. Nicholas set his cup down with a decisive click. Anton, we need to talk about what happens next. Yes, Volsky agreed quietly. We do? The phone has been ringing nonstop since last night, Nicholas said, slipping easily into his manager role. Carnegie Hall wants you for their fall gala. London is asking about availability for a special concert with the Philharmonic. 3 record labels have already reached out about an exclusive recording contract. For my performances of the standard repertoire? Volsky asked. Nicholas shook his head. For your compositions. Word has spread about that final piece you played. They're calling it the musical event of the decade. The return of Anton Volsky. Not just as a performer, but as a composer. Volsky was silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the park below. An old man was feeding pigeons on a bench. A young couple walked hand in hand along a winding path. A child chased a ball across an open green space, laughing. I have a garden that needs tending, he said finally. Tomatoes don't water themselves. Lucia made a sound that was half laugh, half snort. Tomatoes! Anton, we're talking about your music reaching thousands, millions even. About your compositions being performed in concert halls around the world. I have students, Volsky continued as if she hadn't spoken. Lee is just beginning to understand phrasing in the Clementi sonatinas, and Pablo has finally mastered his scales in contrary motion. Nicholas leaned forward. You can still teach, Anton. Between concerts, between tours, many great artists also teach. Volsky turned back from the window, meeting his friend's eager gaze. I left because the music was getting lost, Nicholas. Under the weight of expectations, reviews, ticket sales, recording contracts, I couldn't hear it anymore. I couldn't feel it. He tapped his chest. In here. But it would be different this time, Nicholas insisted. You're different. Older, wiser. You know what matters now. Yes, Volsky said. I do know what matters. He stood and walked to the piano. His fingers found the keys without looking, playing a few notes of the composition he had performed the night before. When I play for Mrs. Abernathy and she falls asleep with a smile on her face, that matters, he said, still playing softly. When Lee finally understands how to make a phrase sing, and his eyes light up with the discovery, that matters. He looked up at his old friends. But last night, when I played for that ballroom full of strangers and for a few minutes we all breathed together, felt together, that mattered too. Lucia joined him at the piano. Her hands, now marked with age spots and slightly twisted with arthritis, hovered over the keys beside his. You don't have to choose, Anton, she said gently. You never did. Volsky stopped playing and turned to face them both. I won't go back to what it was before, he said firmly. The endless touring. The pressure, the isolation, even in the midst of crowds. What if, Nicholas said carefully, we found a different way? Limited performances. Maybe a small recording project fee.